Well, good afternoon, everybody. As Hertz mentioned, I'm Jocelyn Fraser. I'm an adjunct professor in mining engineering at the University of British Columbia. That's in Vancouver on Canada's west coast. It's my second time at Restore, and I'm just really excited to have the opportunity to spend the week with all of you and sort of see how your brains work and tick over on these big sustainability issues. So what I want to talk about this afternoon are these three topics: sustainable development, trust, and something called shared value. So these aren't new ideas. The concept of sustainable development was introduced back in 1987, long before some of you were born, I suspect, in a book that's commonly referred to as the Brundtland Report, but it was called Our Common Future. And it gave us the definition of sustainable development that's most widely used still today, and I'm sure familiar to all of you. That idea about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we see these ideas, if I can make the slide move, yep. We can see these ideas embedded in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, that global agenda for transformative change, endorsed by 190 nations, but, and here's what I think is really important, also endorsed by business, industry, development agencies, civil society groups, investors, and a whole host of other non-governmental actors and interested parties. And that makes this agenda a little bit different than its precursors. Now, I would argue that all of these topics remain as relevant today as they were when they were introduced back in 2015. And of course, we see them embedded in a number of the challenges. SDG 6, which is water and sanitation, obviously very applicable for the Gaza challenge. Industry, innovation, and infrastructure, we would argue, goes across a couple of the challenges. Number 7 is affordable and clean energy, very relevant to the geothermal discussions. And we have two groups that are looking at issues related to mining. And I would suggest to you that mining is an industry that intersects with each and every one of these sustainable development goals. So I've worked in the sustainability space for about 30 years, yikes. And I would say, in general terms, I'm a pretty optimistic person. I feel a little sense of disquiet these days on the sustainability space, where I see that a large number of issues have been either stalled or derailed or moved down the global agenda. And there's lots of reasons for that. I appreciate that. But nevertheless, I find some things a little disquieting. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a major news story in North America, where I'm from, that talked about how global financial institutions invested $900 billion US dollars in fossil fuel subsidies in 2025. We saw this morning in the Gaza case that 74 billion would be required to rebuild their infrastructure. So surely some of that nearly $1 trillion would have been better invested in initiatives that really drive sustainability. And I'm not the only person that's thinking this. This slide comes from a study that was conducted by leading environmental and sustainability consultancies, ERM, GlobeScan, Volans, and Business for Social Responsibility. And there's strong agreement that sustainability approaches need to change. We need to really focus on creating value. And I think that the idea of creating value is so important, but I do think it raises two significant challenges. The first is, how do we get companies to move away from short-term return on investment assessments that can really obscure some of the most significant opportunities for sustainable development? And two, how do we unlock value when we're trying to tackle the wicked problems of sustainability? So these are the problems that are too big for any one group to solve acting unilaterally. We really need collaboration and trust across a different range of actors to make sure that we can drive change. Now, I think there is an important role for business and industry because they often have the capital, both financial and human, to advance sustainable development and to catalyze change. And we see now that leading companies really do think about sustainability as a source of value, not just a cost of doing business. And we've seen that some of these companies have found ways to recognize the value of intangible assets. Things like reputation capital, investor perception, and trust. And here's where we have a problem. This graph comes from a study that was conducted by GlobeScan. They're a Canadian consultancy. They've been polling on trust for 20 years. Every year, they survey 30,000 people in 33 markets across the world. Now, what we see here, I suppose, is sort of encouraging for us, scientists and academics, because we're the most trusted sector. But I think when we look at the results overall, it suggests that globally, there is a crisis of trust. And I think that crisis in trust is particularly significant for the mining sector, a sector which has sat at the bottom of the trust polling for all of the 20 years that it's been done. And I would point out that GlobeScan works in collaboration with the International Council for Mining and Metals, ICMM. So we see that this is an approach that has industry participation within it. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting about this study is that one of GlobeScan's key findings is that social legitimacy is strongest where the sector is viewed as meeting essential human needs. So this to me presents an interesting dichotomy. Mining is needed to meet most essential human needs. If it wasn't farmed, it likely was mined. But look at the trust difference between farming, the most trusted industrial sector, and mining, the least trusted to act in the best interests of society. And the reasons for that lack of trust are pretty well established. We see them in concerns about environment, social, and governance issues, right? Environmental disasters, human rights abuses, including forced and child labor, disrespect for Indigenous rights, allegations of corruption, and beneficial ownership schemes which see taxes paid not in the jurisdictions where that income is earned. And I think it's fair to say that this has prompted some pretty significant challenges around how mining benefits communities. And we see a dissatisfaction for social and environmental impacts that occur locally for benefits that go elsewhere, oftentimes to shareholders in the global north. Now, in light of these challenges, some people have said, you know what, we just don't need to mine anymore. We don't need any more mining. We should use circular economy chains and recycling. Now, both of these approaches are great ways to meet a percentage of the commodities that we need. The challenge is they're not sufficient to meet predicted global demand. So even for metals like cobalt and aluminium that have relatively high recycle rates at about 70%, that's only predicted to meet 30% of future global demand. So this suggests that while these ideas are important and a valuable source of minerals, they won't necessarily replace mining, especially not over the short term. And I think it's important to draw your attention to another topic that was embedded and defined in that 1987 book, Our Common Future, this idea of a just transition. And I know Appa will be talking more about this in her talk later in the week. But this is an idea that nobody should be left behind as we make our transition to a more sustainable world. An end to mining would mean an end to the jobs for 4 million people who work in the formal mining sector and another 100 million people who work in the informal or artisanal mining sector. Now, these job losses would obviously be felt by the individuals, but I would suggest they'd also be felt by their communities and by countries, especially by countries that are considered to be mining dependent. And that list of countries includes places in the global north, like Canada, where I'm from, where 21% of our exports come from minerals, and a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in Mongolia, where one of our cases is located, where 26% of GDP comes from mining. An end to mining would also cripple industries like energy provision and delivery, and it would cripple 50% of the world's food production that relies upon synthetic fertilizers. So I'm a firm believer that mining has the ability to be a catalyst for sustainable development, but I'm not sure that it's fulfilling its potential. And one of the questions I've been asking myself is the business model for mining fit for purpose to deliver sustainable development? And here's a very simple look at a business model for mining, which has remained relatively unchanged for decades. And for the miners in the room, if you disagree with me on this, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it when we get to the questions section. But I would say once mineral exploration has occurred and an ore body has been discovered that is deemed to be commercially viable, the company applies to the owner of the mineral rights, typically a government, for permission to operate and build the mine. The company invests the capital to do that, and they capture value by selling their production. The sale of that product generates royalties and revenues that are paid to national governments, pays for taxes and local hiring. It returns investment to shareholders. And in many cases, well, a growing number of cases around the world, it's used for the funding of impact benefit or community development agreements. Typically, a percentage of those revenues and profits are used to fund corporate social responsibility programs, which I'll come back to in just a minute. So, as I mentioned, this business model has remained relatively unchanged for decades. So let's just think about how much society has changed in the nearly 40 years since Our Common Future was published. In that 40 years, we've seen the advent of the internet, social media, globalization, changing paradigms around workplace and human culture, diversity. We've seen the rise of digital economies, and of course, most recently, conversations have been dominated about the role of artificial intelligence. And those are just a few of the major social transformations. So I would be curious to see what could happen if mining embraced a business model for sustainability. And what would the difference be? Well, a business model for sustainability delivers value to society, not just to shareholders, and it requires collaboration to address these wicked problems of sustainability. Now, because it requires collaboration, collaboration needs trust, and here, of course, is where we come back to one of our fundamental problems, right? Because mining companies are not seen to be acting in the best interests of society. Now, there are people who view mining through a business value lens, and those folks would say, mining does deliver value to society because it provides the metals, minerals, and materials that are used and needed for the goods that the world wants and needs and buys. But I would suggest that concerns about adverse social and environmental impacts have really signaled an end to justifying a project purely based on the need for the commodity. The other thing that we're seeing around this lack of trust is empirical evidence of concern, and we're seeing protests against mining projects around the world. These pictures come from news stories. They could have come from any country in the world. And while the causes of conflict can be complex and interwoven, I would argue the big driver of conflict is this sense that the business model of mining has failed to deliver long-term sustainable development in resource-rich regions around the world. And those protests are also reflected in this empirical data from the Responsible Mining Index. This is a study that is produced biannually by the World Resources Forum, and it assesses 25 large-scale mining companies. Some of you may see your company's name up there, across 6 dimensions or 6 themes, one being community well-being. How well are companies meeting community expectations for well-being? And we can see here that the 20-25% average was just down here at around 24%. And equally problematic is the fact that there's a significant gap between commitment and effectiveness. So what this graph from the same study shows us that while companies score on average 44% on the commitment indicators, they score much lower. They struggle to provide evidence demonstrating that they're assessing, tracking, improving their performance with an average score there of only 12%. So this leads to my central research question about what needs to change for mining really to be a catalyst for sustainable development. And before joining UBC, I worked as a social performance practitioner. And so I was optimistic that CSR, as we like to call it, might provide a pathway for a more sustainable future for mining. Corporate social responsibility is a pretty standard industry response to social expectations. And the intent here is good, whether it's philanthropic investment or moving through this paradigm of responsibility. The challenge is, research tells us that corporate social responsibility has failed to deliver social and economic transformation. So sustainability leaders are saying, well, what you really need to do is make sure that as you look for social responsibility programs, they intersect with the core business of the company, because this then can open innovative ideas for collaborative partnerships. And so one aspect that I think has a lot of promise is that idea called creating shared value. So this is an economic strategy. The name was introduced back in 2011 by Harvard professors Michael Porter and Mark Kramer to really describe an approach where business benefits from addressing social problems that intersect with their need. We could often refer to this as sort of a win-win approach. And we have seen some really good examples of that through the course of time, because while this terminology, creating shared value, is new, the idea itself isn't that new. Here is an example of creating shared value from 2005, before the CSV term was introduced. So Ghana, as some of you in the room will know, was a country that for many years had the 5th largest malaria burden. That was really impacting AngloGold Ashanti's operations in Ghana, where they were losing 7,800 days, that's right in the middle there, 7,500 work days a month to malaria. So they ran a calculation about the costs of doing nothing versus the costs of implementing a malaria control program. And what they discovered was that if they worked with communities, healthcare providers, and government to introduce this malaria control program, they had the potential to reduce cases significantly. They really hoped that they would reduce cases by 50% within 2 years. And they achieved that objective by working collaboratively in just 13 months. And you can see here, hospital admissions were sitting at $6,800 a month, 6,800 people a month, pardon me, and 13 months later, down to 100. So I think that's a pretty interesting story. And I think that the place that we can really look for these points of intersection is within the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Because here we see a number of points of intersection where mining companies and communities have common needs. Good health is one. I would suggest that water is another one. So mining companies need water, often a lot of it for their operations. And 2/3 of the world's large mines already sit in areas of water scarcity. Competition for this scarce resource can frequently be a trigger for conflict or an opportunity for collaboration. Because communities need water too, for irrigating crops, for feeding their livestock, for spiritual and religious purposes, to generate electricity, for recreation, and a host of other pursuits. And this common point of intersection gives us an opportunity then to explore opportunities for collaborative partnerships that could create shared value. So what are the attributes of shared value? What really differentiates it from other forms of corporate social responsibility? And I would say the really important part is in the middle here. It's the collaboration part. How do we co-define the problem and the opportunity? How do we work together to design a solution? And how do we create co-decision-making as the initiative is rolled out, right? I think the other thing that's so important to stress is this isn't about avoiding trade-offs, right? Creating shared value gives us the opportunity to reframe trade-offs from either this or that to this and that. So not corporate profit versus community development and corporate profit. So a number of years ago, I did some research in Peru, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. I also just want to point out that, you know, as we think about social responsibility, it's a bit of a journey. I think it often starts for a company with philanthropic investment, but that's transactional. It's one way. I give you the check and you go away and do what you want to do. We do see lots of examples and a growing number of examples of transitional CSR, where there's a little bit of engagement. But the real power, I think, is on this approach to transformative engagement, where I really think you need to look for opportunities to create shared value. So 10 years ago, when I did my PhD research, my principal case study was in Peru. And this is a project that will be familiar to some of you, because I think there might be some folks in the room from Freeport-McMoRan. But the basic idea was that Freeport operates the Cerro Verde mine. It's a very large copper mine in the southern part of Peru. It's an area of water scarcity. It's also an area where there have been a number of large projects that have been stalled or derailed as a result of competition with farmers for this scarce resource of water. So as the company went out to do their consultation, they heard from civil engineers and social groups to say, well, can you do anything about a problem that's confronting us? And at that time, the city of Arequipa, with a population of about 1 million people, was discharging 90% of its municipal wastewater directly into the Rio Chile, which is the principal water source for the region. And downstream of the mine sits a rich agricultural region called La Jolla. This is a picture of what the water flowing in the Rio Chile looked like at that time. So following a period of consultation and engagement, it was decided that the company would build, operate, and ultimately transfer the ownership of a municipal wastewater treatment system. They would operate it collaboratively with the local water authority. And in exchange for this social investment, the mine would get a percentage of the treated wastewater for use in its expanded operations, and the remainder of the water would go back into the Rio Chile, helping to rehabilitate the river's health. This picture was taken just 5 months after the wastewater treatment plant began its operations. So for shared value to work, it needs to deliver social benefit. Municipal wastewater treatment, improved river health, also associated reduction of illness from waterborne diseases and the medical costs associated with that, and capacity building for the local water authority that's working in collaboration to run this new plant. It also has to deliver business value. And the return on investment here, once again, was quantifiable. The company got water for its expanded operations in a manner that did not put them in competition with farmers for this scarce resource. We can argue that it shows benevolence, acting in the best interests of society, which then helped to build trust. So I think in all the cases that I've examined in my research work at UBC and in some of the applied work I'm doing, one of the things that's consistent is that inside companies, it's super important to demonstrate that value can be created from sustainable development, right? When targeting decision makers inside companies, we really need a link to value creation, sort of a pragmatic approach to enterprise risk management. Now, external audiences, well, they require a different approach. Mining companies frequently go into communities with a description of their project and ask for feedback, right? Sometimes they use an approach that I would describe as DAD, decide, announce, and defend. Communities often feel like they don't have sufficient time or resources to evaluate the materials that are on offer. They're uncertain how, or maybe if, their feedback is going to be used. There can often be concerns about the transparency of materials or materials that are available to them. So there can be a lot of questions around the decision-making for these projects. And as I mentioned, this lack of trust can be a major impediment. So for companies that want to create shared value, what do they need to do? I would suggest they need a model of engagement that puts these intersecting issues at the center of their discussion. So the project itself is not at the center, a sustainability issue is. And that might be water, it might be good health, it might be decent work and economic growth, it might be climate action. Again, the Sustainable Development Goals offer us a pretty nice pathway for deciding what issues should be discussed. The key is you decide the issue in collaboration with your communities of interest, those stakeholders and rights holders. It's not for the company to go into a community and tell them what they need and how they should do it, right? So it requires different approaches to engagement, approaches that move along this spectrum that was developed by the International Association of Public Participation, from merely informing to taking us through to places of collaboration, and the one that's blocked is empowerment. Now, I think empowerment is always going to be a little bit of a stretch for mining companies because they do have this significant risk that they manage and a significant financial investment. But there's heaps of opportunities for collaboration. And I found really good examples of projects in countries like Mongolia, Ecuador, Peru, Ethiopia, South Africa, and in communities in the Canadian North. Some have been led by junior miners, highly dependent on the equity markets for cash, that really have to build a very robust justification for using money for social performance as opposed to doing an extra drill hole. They've been led by mid-tier companies that sometimes can be a little bit more nimble in their decision-making. Or they've been led by large-scale multinational corporations, such as the one I just mentioned, who were willing to take on the risk of doing something that benefits society. I think before closing, I would be remiss if I didn't sort of speak for a moment. Sorry, I'm one slide behind here. If I didn't speak for a moment about some of the challenges, because as I mentioned, win-win strategies often get a fair amount of criticism, and there's good reasons for that. These strategies can be difficult to implement. There really is a need to break down organizational silos and build interdisciplinary teams, which is one of the things I'm super excited about our work here this week, because we see so many different areas of expertise and professional experience coming together. Those interdisciplinary teams need to have the requisite skills to design, deliver, measure the success of sustainability initiatives. I really do feel that conventional business models, primarily in the mining sector, but potentially in other sectors as well, that are really anchored by production schedules and budgets, can create tension when we're trying to develop sustainable initiatives, and especially shared value initiatives, because they take a little bit longer to plan, to develop, to collaborate, and then to deliver. I think traditional philanthropic investment and corporate social responsibility is absolutely necessary and needed, but we don't see evidence that it's really advancing sustainable development, right? And I think that we often see communities, they're not really accustomed to the idea of working together. We have these trust issues. And so there are new approaches to engagement that are required to enable those types of collaboration that are so important for addressing wicked problems to come to fruition. The other thing I would mention is a lot of these traditional projects measure their success in terms of dollars spent or the number of people connected. We heard this morning in one of the cases where someone said, you know, we've touched the lives of 10,000 people. These are outputs. We really need to move along the spectrum of measurement to impact, right? And in between there, I guess we can look at output, outcome, but ultimately, we really want to be at impact. I think that there's a lot of opportunity. The fact that topics like trust apparently dominated discussions at the Davos Economic Summit this year, you know, as leaders grappled with things like political uncertainty, turbulence, and increasing calls for accountability. The fact that these issues are rising up the agenda, I think creates an opportunity for us. Will it be easy to change the business model of mining? No. No. Will it be worth it? Yes, because we might end up with both better business and a better world. I'd be really happy to take your questions.